I'm going to turn it over to my more than able and competent colleagues. I'm going to give it to Anthony McDonald, and who else is handling this? Patricia and Tina and George, the rest that are going to be here. Also, very, very much welcome our guests. I want to thank you, Sergeant Terrance Weems and John Jackson, Reverend, for being here, and the others who are going to be a part of our group. Just thank you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And okay, folks, here we go. Who's next
Good
up?
morning, everybody. Just
right.
a couple of things to give you on logistics. If you notice in the chat room, I posted a couple of things for you to review. If you have questions for any of our panelists, please post those questions in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that chat box and presenting questions to them as our panelists are talking. Also, our panelists for today, we want to thank you for joining us. Mr. Terrance Weems, Mike DeHaven, Lakeisha Frazier, Jason Clanton, Dex Knight, and the Reverend John Jackson. And again, to those panelists, thank you for joining us today. I know some of you have had conversations with our moderator, Patricia Wisniewski. Patricia will be coming on next to introduce herself, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. And Tina, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I do not have anything at this time. I will do the reflections at the end of the forum.
So Patricia, I'll turn it over to you as our moderator for today.
Okay, thank you, Tony. First of all, welcome everybody. I'm honored to be here today. I'm just a local documentary filmmaker, and I was asked to be moderator today, and I'm honored and humbled by that. So I'm looking forward to the conversations we're going to have. I think George is our first presenter, so we're going to turn it over to George, and then we'll have some open discussion, and later some additional films and things that we can open that discussion up with. So George, I'm going to let you start.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My job is to explain structural racism in 8 minutes. So there's a lot of detail that will be left out, and I will make statements that have support. You can ask me about that later. We're going to use the groundwater approach, which is a metaphor or an analogy about how racism works in our society. And it's the story of the fish, the lake, and the groundwater. If you find one fish floating belly up in the lake, you're likely to try to figure out what's wrong with the fish. And so you look at the individual. You know, if there are problems based on race, you look at the individual first. If there are 300 fish floating belly up in the lake, then you may want to look at the water. What's in the water? And those represent the institutions and the systems that we have in our country. And if there's a problem there, you try to change the institution. But what often happens is that fish still keep dying. And then you have to look at the groundwater. And the groundwater is under the surface, it's hidden, but it connects all of the water bodies in the world in one way or the other, 95% of the water. And in that sense, you're looking at what are the things, you know, in racism terms, what are the things that poison the atmosphere that are hidden from us? And it's socialization and implicit and unconscious biases. You know, what are those biases? And without going through proofs here, you know, there's a bias against Black and in favor of white. There's a bias against women. There's a bias for men. There's a bias against LGBT people, and there's a bias sometimes against people of non-Christian religions. We're all programmed with these biases. We didn't ask for them, but they underlie our understanding from early on. Some of them come from history, slavery and Jim Crow, and our failure as a nation to remedy the effects of those things. And some are current. You can think of it this way, is that when you first learned to drive, what did you do? You were really conscious. You got in the car, you adjusted the seat, the mirrors, you pulled out slowly, you look at cars, you check your mirrors all the time. You're looking for the lights and the lights of the cars. And after a while, you drive to work and you wonder what route you took. It all becomes unconscious. It's part of your unconscious. And socialization works that way. You know, racial inequities are created by racist policies. As I said, some are current, some are past, and they're supported by racist ideas. And these racist ideas are often unconscious. And what they cause is worse outcomes for Black Americans and people of color in every area of human existence. And this is true in healthcare, in education, in business, in banking, in home ownership, in wealth accumulation, in law enforcement, and in incarceration. What some people say is that, well, don't differences in culture and behavior explain this, or socioeconomic differences, and those kind of things. And without going into all of the details there, these things have been studied, and I'll give a couple of examples. For instance, in employment, they sent out 5,000 resumes, some with Black sounding names and some with white sounding names. And the white sounding names got callbacks 1.5 times more often than Black. And so with equal kinds of qualifications, the only thing that was different was the apparent race of the person. In healthcare and educational status, or rather economics, we find that white women with high school education have lower infant mortality rates than Black women with PhDs and master's. With incarceration and wealth, the statistics show that the poorest 10% of white men have lower incarceration rates than the wealthiest 10% of Black men. In policing, one of the things we're talking about today, there is a fairly famous shoot, don't shoot test that police officers may be aware of. And pretty consistently, when they show images of people with something in their hands, they're looking for a gun, and sometimes it's a gun, sometimes it's a wallet or a comb. And consistently, African Americans are shot in error more often than white people, though police officers are a little better at this because of their training. So we look at the inequities. For instance, in Valparaiso, the 2019 statistics show that 3.5% of the population is African American, but 9.5% of the warnings are issued to African Americans, and a little over 10% of the citations are issued to African Americans. Now, this could be due to implicit bias on the police officer's part. On the other hand, it could also be impacted by inequities in other systems, wealth and housing and the ability to maintain a car, those kind of things. People who care about equitable solutions rarely look at the interplay between all of the inequities that exist. But one thing we can say is that in the United States, the number one social determiner of outcomes is race. Complex social problems require complex and cross-systems collaborations. So the election of a new president is not going to solve all our problems. There's plenty of work for us to do. I hope that this has had at least some explanation of how racism and socialization bolsters the bad outcomes that come. And I'm glad to answer questions later about any of the statements that I've made to support them. And I think I've come in at my 8 minutes. So thank you.
Thank you, George. We're going to move on to a video now.
Tina, I think we're having some technical difficulties with the video. Just the sound button once you load up the share screen option.
Some police officers who are not so good.
And my fear is that you run across one of those bad ones.
For some reason, people of color have always been a target by the police.
Before they became a policeman, they were a person. And that person took all their ideas and all their thoughts and all their prejudice into their job.
Why would a police officer assume that you did something bad? Maybe because of my skin color.
I remember being put in handcuffs for something that had nothing to do with me. I was literally walking in the mall. Cops slammed me on the ground, busted my lip, chipped my tooth. That actually made me really mad.
How about the time they pulled us over with me in the car and arrested me and left all of you guys sitting in the car and nobody knew how to drive on the side of the road because the bumper on the car was kind of hanging off?
No.
You know, we live in Puyallup. There's people that don't even have a bumper on their car.
My rear brake light wasn't working, and I got to my destination and they were working.
I was about your age, actually. They grabbed me.
Why?
I didn't know at the time. They just grabbed me. They threw me onto the police car.
I got tased that time. That time they tased me because they said I wasn't complying.
Ariel, are you okay?
What's wrong, baby? I'm okay, I'm alive, all right? Every day I get to see you, I get to do this, right? All right, come on, let's calm down, let's finish this, all right? You good? Hey, you're making me cry. Come on.
You have to be careful when you're out there in this world because this world's not going to always be honest or fair to you. I know, Sean, you got a little bit lighter than the rest of them, so it's a possibility you won't get stopped.
Sound like you just pulled him over.
Okay. If you're driving, cop pulls you over?
Police gets out the car, comes to the window, tick, 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 tick. What would you do?
License and registration, please, ma'am.
Why do you think I pulled you over?
I don't know, tell me. When a police officer says something you don't, you're black. You can't be looking at them saying, oh, I don't know, why don't you tell me? Well, I mean, that right there is giving them the license to pull you out of your car and physically harm you, because it will be done.
Don't get upset, don't get sassy. Why did you pull me over? You don't have, just follow instructions and stay calm.
Okay.
Do you think just being a police officer and pulling you over, regardless of if you feel you've done something or not, they should get your respect?
That's a tricky question.
The answer is yes.
Yes.
If you gotta go to your wallet to get your ID, say, can I go reach in my back pocket to get my ID out?
You could do what I do, and I show them my hands, so when they're walking up, they see I don't have anything in my hands.
I'm Errol Sky Williams, and I have nothing that will harm you or hurt you.
And what's the next place you put your hands when you're driving or on the steering wheel with your hands out?
If at all possible, turn your phone on.
And call someone and put it on speaker.
Yeah. But whatever you're doing, I want you to say what you're doing before you do it.
You don't write any statements.
Well, you have to write a statement.
You don't have to write anything. You're a minor. I'm responsible for you. No one can tell you anything else.
If he tells you to be quiet, be quiet. Do everything that you can to get back to me. I see it weighing on you, and I don't want it to weigh on you.
I'm just worried about Donovan. I'm worried about him now.
Who are you guys talking about?
My nephew and her cousin.
I don't want him to be shot. I don't want him to go to jail.
You guys, if you could say anything to police, what would you say?
Learn about people, learn about their problems.
Take some diversity training. I mean, it should be like at this point, like a monthly requirement.
You know, there's really nothing at this point that they could do that would make me feel any safer with them without them just point blank clearing them all out and starting all over from scratch.
So don't always assume that all of them are bad.
But all you see on the news and in newspapers, and it keeps happening. It's just in a different way. It's like how people are like, you should forgive so-and-so, but they keep doing it to me. I forgave them, but they keep doing it to me. It gets harder and harder to forgive them.
Wow.
Hello, everyone. That was very heart-wrenching to watch. And I think we're all hurting by this subject, and we need to find ways, in different ways we're hurting, but we need to find ways to come together and maybe share our experiences so we can find solutions to something like that. Lakeisha, are you here today?
Yes, I am.
Hi, I first, as a mother, Lakeisha's our community member. As a mother, watching that video, I know it had to be heart-wrenching for you. And can you share some of your experiences? Because I think through stories and sharing, we all get to come to a better awareness of one another and get a better sense of what's going on in our community. Would you mind sharing, Lakeisha?
Oh, no, not at all. I watched the video previously when it was sent as an attachment to an email, and watching it again, it does nearly bring you to tears. I have been fortunate to not have any personal negative interactions with the police, nor my two children. However, now with social media and the increased publicity of the negative and overly aggressive interactions with the police and minorities, it's overwhelming. It is heartbreaking. And I have come to a point where there's been times where I just literally have to disconnect from watching it and seeing it and hearing about it, because my heart can't take it anymore.
And how old are you, Lakeisha?
I have an 18-year-old son and a 20-year-old daughter.
And through this, the whole George Floyd experience, what kind of conversations have you had with your children?
My 20-year-old daughter was very impacted by that occurrence. And again, just viewing and hearing and seeing as everyone else did as well. And here in our city, we reside in Fort Wayne, Indiana. There were some organized protests, and I'm sure maybe some planned or unplanned rioting also occurred. And my daughter, initially, she had expressed to me that she wanted to participate in the protest because of the wrongness that she felt occurred with that particular case. And while my mind was like, yes, participate, my heart was afraid for her to do so, because you don't know what's going to happen. As it did, protests turned into rioting, and there were some negative interactions that occurred between people and the police. So what I had stated to her was that in my mind, to me, in my lifetime, this is the first time that I have seen, witnessed other races being equally or even more so outraged than the minority, or as the minority. And until all races are disgusted by racism, to me, it won't change.
I totally, I totally agree with that comment, that we all have to be outraged and be part of the solution. I'd like to kind of shift over to Sergeant Weems for a minute. Sergeant Weems, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and how you came into policing?
My name is Terrance Weems. I am a native of Gary, Indiana, born and raised Glen Ryan. Went to William A. Word High School, for those of you who are familiar with the Miller area. Graduated from Word High School and went to college. While I was in college, I was actually a business major, switched to sociology, and had planned to go to law school. During that time, I got very active in the Black Student Union on campus, and we had a very strong and active Black Student Union while I was there. During that time, I decided, you know what, I think I'm gonna go into law enforcement. My desire was to do that, to try and help and make some changes from within. And that's why that's how I got into law enforcement, and got hired by the Indiana State Police in 1994. And here I am still today, doing that and doing my best to make some changes from within. As far as some experiences, it's funny, and I shouldn't say funny, it's not funny, haha, but it's funny. It's I didn't necessarily have to give the talk to my children, but I did give the talk to my children, and unfortunately had to give that talk while I was being stopped by the police. Sometimes being stopped by the police for various reasons, many of which had nothing to do with the violation of Indiana traffic law. But that's a whole nother story. But one of the things that I think I like to try and do, even when I am stopping somebody in that discussion, or that the feeling that they're being stopped for some reason other than a traffic infraction, I try and use that traffic stop as a teaching moment or as a learning opportunity, both for myself and for that person who's been stopped. And believe it or not, I get told that I stopped. What do they say? You stopped me because I was white. And I say, wow, really? You think they'll allow me to do that? But that's a whole nother story. So that's me in a 2-minute nutshell.
Thank you, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Let me try to bring in another person here, community member, Jason. Jason, can you introduce yourself and maybe give us a little background on you as a community member?
Yes, hi, my name is Jason Clanton. I'm a 37-year-old African-American who's never been arrested or put in handcuffs or anything to really do with the police. I was born and raised in Hammond, Indiana, graduated from Gavitt High School, went on to study at Purdue Calumet, also studied abroad in Spain for 2 semesters, majored in international studies in Spanish, and am a worldly individual, currently in graduate school for a master's in public health. And when it comes to the police, my very first runnings in with the police was in 6th grade. There was the Oklahoma City bombing, and there was a picture of a firefighter holding a little baby that was like dangling by its arms. And I was a very sensitive child growing up. So that just like, I was crying for like days. Like, I gotta help that baby, I gotta help the baby. So my parents took me to City Hall so I could talk to representatives. They're like weekly meetings. And in the middle of the meeting, like I just bust out crying because I kept thinking about the baby. And so my mom had to finish it for me. And they gave me permission to do like tag days at the grocery stores to raise money and to walk through City Hall and collect the money for the children. So it worked out fine doing that until I got to the police department in City Hall. And once I got in there, I was told that they don't know where the money is going and what am I doing here and I need to get out. And I just cried and I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell my mom. I didn't tell any of the people who gave me permission because I didn't want the police to get in trouble or even like get mad at me, you know, like, so that was my first run-ins with them, that they just didn't trust me. And I was, you know, 11 years old. The second most traumatic incident was when I was 17 years old, coming from Zero Gravity in Maryville. It was like a teen dance club. It's closed now, but friends and I were leaving and went to White Castles on US 30 and came out, and then we had three SWAT cars behind us, and 3 officers ran up on my car with big black rifles and were just pointed at us and like where you coming from? Where you just like hollering, and it was just so confusing. And then they said, oh, it couldn't have been them because they just came from White Castles. And then they just all turned their lights off and just sped off. But here I am, I almost peed on myself, like literally. Things that happen, and once again, you don't go home and tell your mom. If this were other, you know, other families or different dynamics or different race, they might lower it up and, you know, started a scene and like, not my baby, you're not gonna do that. But when you're Black, you kind of gotta, sometimes you feel like you have to stay in your place and you don't want to ruffle feathers. You do not want to cause a scene because, what if you lose your job? What if you, just all these snowball effects that you think about. Also, driving while Black is a whole nother thing that I deal with personally because I am a big Black man and I'm 6'4". And when a police officer would I don't get pulled over a lot. I got my first speeding ticket 2 years ago. But when a police officer will pull you over and I am very self-aware of how I look and who I am. So I know I'm a 6'4" Black man. But sometimes when they see you, they will have to pump their chest out a little more or produce all of this toxic masculinity, which is not necessary because all you have to do is talk. And I even have white friends that tell me, they try to give me the rundown of like what to do if I get pulled over. And, you know, they're white. And they say, oh, Jason, you have this awesome personality. All you have to do is just talk. Once you talk, then they'll know you're not one of the bad ones, which has stuck with me. So I remember, okay, now I know if I get pulled over, just use my personality. Let them know I'm not aggressive. I'm not the aggressor. Like, please, you know. So also, like, when I was 22 years old, 23, I stopped wearing hats while I was driving. I I don't want to wear a hat because I don't want you to think I'm a gangbanger. I don't want you to think anything. Like all of my cars have to have tinted windows. I don't want you looking in my car. That goes for police and civilians. It always has to have tints on my car because I just feel very in the streets. I just want to be left alone, you know, and I don't want you saying I did anything. And once a police officer gets behind you, me personally, I tense up very, very hard. Like the hair on the back of my neck can go up. And 9 times out of 10, I'm turning into the nearest gas station or grocery store because you are behind me and I don't know why. And something I was talking to Pat about yesterday was, so I'm licensed to carry in Indiana. Now, that's the thing that I have to worry about too, because I'm not sure if, Mr. Weems, I don't know if you can like validate this, but once a police officer runs your license plates, does it show that you are licensed to carry?
It depends.
Okay.
It can, but that depends on if you're the registered owner of the vehicle and that sort of thing. And it's funny that you said that you don't wear hats while you're driving, and I don't wear hats when I'm driving either. And that's been for a very, very long time for that same reason.
Yes. And so a few friends of mine told me that when they got pulled over, that they're licensed to carry also. And when they got pulled over, that was the first thing the officers asked them was like, do they have their gun on them and where's their gun? I don't want any of those questions. So I'm like, I'm even scared to carry, even though I'm legal, you know? So it's a lot of things that me as a Black man, that some of them might be internal, you know, we all have our own internal biases, but, and it might not be the exact truth, but I just really, or maybe some things that they can do is like, of course, take cultural sensitivity trainings. No one wants to do them, but maybe if you plant a seed, that will stick. And also a buddy program with Black children in the communities. So you could actually have little Black Bobby from down the street and Sergeant so-and-so come pick them up and they can help do desk work or whatever, just to expose them that not all cops are what we see and vice versa. And that child will go back to their neighborhoods and let the people know, like, they're not all bad. They're not all bad. And the last thing that I would like to say about Valparaiso specifically, so in college, I met my friend Chad. He's in this group somewhere. We became best friends when I was like 19 years old. So I always go to Valpo, but he doesn't understand how scary it is for me to go to Valpo, because he likes to like, oh, let's go on a walk, or I don't want to walk around Valparaiso. I don't want the police to see me walking at nighttime. I don't want like anybody to know, like, and I try, you know, it's a cultural exchange. So I have to let you know how I feel. I remember a specific time I had a car that I wasn't so proud about having. I'm not about to drive through Valpo with that, like, because I'm going to get pulled over. Like, nothing's wrong with it, like infraction wise, but I would rather be more up to par when driving through certain areas. And also, have you all heard of sundown towns? So sundown towns are when the Negroes have to be gone by nighttime, or like they might be hung from a tree. Valparaiso was a sundown town until the 1950s. So when these things are in our society, they can't just be eradicated like polio. Like there's no vaccine for racism. So it all starts, I think you all are doing a great job here, and I see all the different races and the different ethnicities on here, and I'm just proud to be a part of this. So thank you.
Jason, thank you so much for sharing all of those intimate stories and feelings that we can understand what it's like from a young Black man's perspective. I'd like to defer to Assistant Chief DeHaven. Mike, could you tell us a little bit about how, just hearing some of these stories, as a police officer in Valparaiso, what's your experience and how are you feeling about all of this?
Well, first of all, Patricia, thank you for inviting me to this. I want to thank the Northwest Indiana African American Alliance for inviting me and, to be a representative of the Valparaiso Police Department. I've been in law enforcement for almost 26 years. I've been here with the Valparaiso Police Department for 24 years. Quite honestly, to hear, what everyone has to say, which is very important. It's hard. I mean, it's kind of a gut punch to hear these things, and I'm sorry that people feel this way, but I do feel that this is very important for especially male whites who are in law enforcement to hear. So I appreciate this opportunity. It's always good to look through a different lens so that we get a perspective on how people feel, because regardless of whether our intentions are to hurt people like apparently the police do at times, what matters is how they feel. And so much of not just, our interactions in law enforcement with the public, but I think in all areas of life with our relationships with our spouses and friends and anybody else, I think communication is key. So, we in law enforcement have to continue to reach out to our communities and specifically to people of color, because it's pretty obvious when you watch the news and listening to all of you who have spoken so far today, watching that video, it pains me. It pains me that, that's the perception by many of law enforcement specific or in general in, the Valparaiso police in particular, because of course that's not my perception. I feel like we do try to communicate with our community and get out. We have several programs that we do, but it's obvious that if this is the perception, that more work still has to be done. So, I can tell you that as the assistant chief of police, and I can tell you that our chief of police, Jeff Ballin, we are very serious about trying to bridge these gaps that apparently we still have.
And Mike, Officer DeHaven, are there discussions going on within the department itself about this issue, especially this year, and so much that has come up in the protests and the killing of George Floyd? Are there discussions in the department on how to do things differently or how to handle things differently?
Yeah, I mean, we're always discussing those things. I can tell you that, we feel that we are doing a good job. I mean, we communicate, I think, a lot with the Northwest Indiana African American Alliance. We are part of that. We do the picnic in the park each year. And I know that's just a small thing, but I mean, I can run through, different all the different programs that we do and how we reach out to people. But at the end of the day, if I were to run through all those, I don't know that it changes anyone's perception or perspective. Like I said, just hearing what everyone's saying, is painful. And, it's just obvious that we've got to continue to reach out to the community, especially community members of color, so we can have open dialogues like this. And hopefully, bridge that gap. I'd like to think that, you know, over the years, maybe things, you know, maybe we have made some inroads. I hope we have, and I hope we continue to do that. But I think we all need to look through different lenses, both the police as well as citizens, and learn more about each other, which, you know, this is a terrific opportunity to do here today. And, you know, really think about these issues and talk and communicate, and hopefully, you know, come to better understanding of one another.
Yeah, I think you're right, Officer DeHaven. And do you, what is your experience? You know, as a white police officer, it's got to be kind of scary right now for you in these times too. And so, you know, what is your experience, or some of the officers' experience, you know, dealing with that right now?
I'm sorry, can you say again? I'm reading some of these messages that are popping up, and I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to know, I know it's got to be really tough as a white police officer right now too. And so I wanted people to also see through your lens, you know, what is a white officer out on the streets, and he sees an African-American speeding or something, and he pulls them over. Is there a lot of tension or extra tension on your part right now too?
Well, I mean, we talk about a lot that we, you know, want to treat everybody fairly, regardless of race or religion or anything like that. But of course, I mean, I'm not going to lie and say that, you know, we're not aware of it. I mean, if we pull over an African-American or a Hispanic, or, you know, somebody of color or whatever, we want to treat them as fairly as we do anybody else. And I can tell you, there's no police officer who comes to work thinking, I want to end up on CNN tonight because, you know, I have some sort of use of force issue, or, you know, that I treated someone unfairly, you know, and the idea is that it's based off of their, you know, their color of their skin or anything else. So, yeah, it's tough, but, you know, that's why, you know, I appreciate being a part of this and hearing everyone. And, you know, we'll try to continue to make inroads and communicate better.
And
Pat, if I could, I'm sorry, if I could interject.
Oh, sure.
There is a question in the chat from Mary Stewart Bethel to everyone, and this is for our officers if they would like to answer. What changes within the police department have been helpful?
Sergeant Weems, do you want to take that one, or?
I can. Changes as far as what type of changes are you speaking of? I'll answer the question and then you can be more specific. One of the things that I believe police departments have not done a very good job of as it relates to police involved shootings, or police action shootings as they're called now, is not releasing the information as quickly as possible, and videos if they are available. One of the things that people don't realize in that regard is that it's a criminal investigation, right? So if the police shoot somebody, whether justified or not, it's still a criminal investigation, and the police are required, responsible, and it is needed for them to conduct a complete, thorough, and accurate investigation. So that's one of the reasons why information is not given out. However, one of the things that police departments across the nation are doing because of this is they are being forced to release information more quickly. And in a number of cases that have happened even this year, had information been released quickly or as quickly as possible, then there wouldn't have been opportunity for disinformation to get out there. And that's one of the things that police departments are getting better at. Another thing that police departments are being forced to do whether they want to or not. Some police departments don't have this issue and some do, and that's diversifying their police department. And I think that is something that police departments as a whole have to do. Fort Wayne, I don't know if anybody knows the history or Fort Wayne has a very deeply entrenched history of racism within the city of Fort Wayne. So if you notice when things occur over there, they spark and they blow up rather quickly. And that's because of the relationship that the police department and the community has, not just the police department, but the city as a whole and the Black community. But that's a whole nother story. But one of the things that we have done better at is releasing information. One of the things that we need to do better at, and we're being forced to do better, and that is diversifying our police departments. If that wasn't the answer to your question, if you could specify, be more specific, and I can answer that.
Yes, I'm really interested. That was very helpful. Thank you. Really interested in what kind of training, other than diversity training and implicit training, which we've had for years and hasn't necessarily worked, and education do police officers receive so they understand and can address kind of the broad perspective of what they have to do in the workplace with their jobs and their community. So what else inside for example, do police have to live within the community? Do police have to engage members of faith communities constructively? What are some of the new and different things, if there are any, that help the police themselves deal with what kind of behaviors are happening in Fort Wayne, so they can better serve and better prepare to serve a diverse community?
I can only speak for the Indiana State Police.
Okay.
But I can also tell you what happened within the city of Gary a number of years ago when Rudy Clay, if you all remember, or I don't know if you all remember him, for a time he was a county commissioner, eventually being elected mayor of the city of Gary after Sky King resigned and that sort of thing. So one of the things that Mayor Rudy Clay put into practice, or his desire to put into practice, was that the police officers, firefighters, city workers had to live in the city of Gary. So they had to be city of Gary residents. That didn't necessarily go over very well. When you have a smaller population, that makes it more difficult. If you have a small population in a very small area, so to say, okay, if you want to be a Hebron police officer, you have to live in the town of Hebron. Or if you want to be a Valpo police officer, you have to live in the town of Valparaiso. What that does now for those communities that are very racially homogeneous, if you want to say that, homogenous, that would mean that the police department intrinsically is going to be exactly what that community is, and that's going to be mostly Caucasian. So if we say that, then we're doing ourselves a disservice because we're not mirroring what the community looks like. So you have to be deliberate and you have to be intentional about your hiring practices when it comes to that part of your question. One of the things that the Indiana State Police did, even this was before Mike Brown was shot down in Ferguson, the Indiana State Police started a process to develop a cultural sensitivity, cultural diversity training. So before that shooting occurred, we had already started that process. After that shooting occurred, we were already in the process of building that program, and we've had that program since shortly after Michael Brown's shooting. And we have went throughout the state doing that program. And one of the things, and I was going to say that later, but I can say it now, you all let me know what days may be good, even on a Saturday, possibly, and I can get those instructors up for the Northwest Indiana African American Alliance to put that training on. And we can invite community members, probably now because COVID has ramped up a little bit. Whether we do it virtually, I'm not sure, but if we can get a venue that's large enough where we can host 40, 50 people or so to put that program on, I think it would be beneficial for you all to see. And I'm not pubbing or anything, the Indiana State Police, but just giving you that insight. But another thing that police departments are aware of, open communication, honestly, is the only way to overcome this right now at this point, because you can't just get rid of an entire police department and start afresh. So you have to communicate. And unfortunately, the only way you overcome sickness, illness, whether it's cancer or broken bone or whatever the case may be. If I break my arm and I broke my wrist in the academy, I went about a month or so before I went to the doctor. It started to heal. If I would have waited another couple of weeks, they would have had to re-break it, and I would have been in a cast for 6 months, right? So it hurt to get it set and to do all of that, but it was needed for it to heal. Uncomfortable conversations have to be had in order for us to get over where we are. And from that point, then we start to move forward and we pay attention to our hiring practices. We look at some things you can't blame the police for, right? So if you look in Minnesota with George Floyd, everybody from the mayor, the city council, and the police chief had a responsibility to make sure that that man wasn't a police officer before he killed George Floyd. But the only people that were being held accountable was the police officers, one of which did it. And if I'm not mistaken, two of the four were like, man, we need to stop and get this dude to the jail or to the hospital or something. But the city council president jumped all over that. You've been a city council president for how long? You've been on the city council for how long? You're the mayor, you've been the mayor, and your police chief has seen a department with no community involvement, and the people, allow that person to continue to be the mayor and not hold him accountable. That's the person that's responsible for hiring the police chief and firing the police chief.
Am I audible?
We have to hold our elected officials responsible in addition to the police departments, because they're the ones ultimately that set the leader. Leadership sets the course for a department. And if we don't hold them responsible, and that's something else that we have to be more aware of and get that conversation out, but open and honest communication.
I was thinking more of, are the police engaged in like the high schools? Do the police go and talk to the high schools or to the elementary school students or to young people about these issues, or involved in that level of education, in addition to what you're talking about in local community?
Right. I can't speak for the local community, but one of the tenets, I guess you could say, for the Indiana State Police is community involvement. So most of the troopers at some level are involved in their communities, whether it be coaching. I hate to say Boy Scouts, but that used to be, but coaching and sports and other community involvement. Those are things that we do. And one of the things that I have been pushing for us to do in regards to recruiting is getting into the middle schools and the high schools to recruit folk before they know what they want to do, right? So by the time they make it to high school, they should have some idea of what they want to do. It's our responsibility to take that time to mentor and coach and bring somebody up so they can apply. I'm speaking specifically for the Indiana State Police because that's my desire, for them to apply to be a troop. They graduate in 2020. By 2024, I want that person applying for the Indiana State Police. So yes, that's something that we do.
If I could interject for a moment, folks, please.
Sure.
If you have questions, please post those questions in the chat. I see we have a lot of hands up, but I don't want the conversation to get skewed. I want to make sure that all of our panelists have a moment to talk. So please go back into mute mode. If you have a question posted in the chat, I will ask you to unmute so that you can have dialogue and exchange with that panelist. But please, we need to make sure that we do this in an orderly fashion. If you have questions, post those in the chat and we'll make sure those questions get asked. Pat, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Sergeant Weems. I'd like to bring in a little spiritual guidance here with Reverend Jackson. Reverend, can you give us some insight here? You've been both a police officer and a pastor. Can you bring some insight to this situation for us?
thank you so much, and to each and everyone that are on the Zoom meeting this morning, and to the organizers, I thank you for including me. It's a tough discussion, and the more we talk, the tougher it gets. Unfortunately, it gets real tough before it gets better. And I don't think, my first insight is that we have not been willing to hear uncomfortable truth long enough for it to affect us. It gets to a point where we just, we just want to say, no, it was just too much, and we move on. But this pain is historic. So I was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois, and south side of Chicago. Actually, the Chatham, West Chesterfield area. I grew up, and I really never had a thought to be a police officer. When I went to Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, I actually had my sight on going becoming a judge. And so when the opportunity came, I was working in a factory, Brock's Candy Company, and the opportunity came to be a police officer because I was a Chicago Housing Authority police officer, and it was during the time, the late '80s, where a lot of money was going into developing police departments within the housing developments, and Chicago was one. And so I needed to feed my family, and I hated the factory. Nothing wrong with factory work, but it just wasn't for me. So I became a police officer, and I was a police officer for 10 years before I accepted my calling to the ministry and started a church here in Gary, Indiana. And so my experiences and what insights and teachings and learnings that I gained from my experience, especially being a police officer, is that there are a lot of professions where people you get into the profession, and when difficult or bad things happen to your colleagues, it just happens to your colleagues. There's not a whole lot of professions where people close ranks to kind of shield one another from whatever challenges they may face. You have heard it called the blue wall. It's real. So that's the first part, is the idea that we got to protect one another, so we close rank, so we don't we cover for one another. And while I was working as an officer, I was sort of like Sergeant Weems. I had an idea that the department was majority African American at first, and I had an idea that we could give a better view to the residents of the housing developments by how we treated them. That was my ideal. That was a dream of mine, that would happen. It was soon dashed because of the culture. And there are a lot of ins and outs in this. There are no quotas. You can't, you don't have quotas where you got to make so many arrests or write so many tickets. But implicitly, if you're not making a certain amount of arrests or you're not writing a certain amount of tickets, there is a way you get looked at. And in roll calls and things like that, there is just, peer pressure is real. And it comes down from the top, it comes down from, it affects all around you. So, these things, it's a culture in policing. And so I figured that the way I had the idea wasn't going to work because of the culture. And there's a lot more to this. We don't have time to get into some of the other details. So I heard somebody just say about, interacting with the community. So I had an opportunity to be a community police officer, and I took it. DARE officer when DARE was in vogue, and the different types of trainings, we would we would experience so that we could, relate to the community. So, we were doing things like softball tournaments and stuff like that. And inevitably, many of the other officers, again, it's a culture, saw that as lazy. You ain't doing police work. You're not out here busting your butt. You're out here interacting with kids and whatnot. And my objective was that, there's some things we can do to help prevent some things later on, and the image. So, there was that you had to me personally had to deal with, and those that were community officers with me. One of the in some of a training, we learned about O.W. Wilson in Chicago. And in the early 60s, he made this promise that, when there's a crime, if something happens, a police car will get there in 3 minutes. So he put all the officers in cars. And what happens then, that also opens up a chasm between the community, because you're riding around in a car most of the time. You're not interacting with the community. And later on, 30 years later, it was realized that you don't need to have it all one way or the other. You got to mix it up. So we were doing things like that, walking the beat, walking up and down. Now you got to understand, working in Robert Taylor Homes and other housing developments is a challenge in itself. Robert Taylor Homes is 11 stories high, 16 apartments on each floor, and the elevators rarely work. So, there were some other issues in there, but the thing that became clear to me, and then study reinforced it. How do we get police departments in the first place? It comes from old slave patrols, paddy rollers. The police department developed from slave patrols. Why was slave patrol? To control Black people. And it developed from there, and you can see it in the culture. And so to change things, we're talking about changing, not just, I just heard, I don't know if it was, I think it was Sergeant Weems said, the target gets on the individual officers when it's more than just the officer. It's a department, is law enforcement in general, is the court systems. You ever wonder why in Chicago? Well, for me in Chicago, growing up in Chicago, going to court is another reality check. Just about everybody that is working on the side to incarcerate are white. And that's the majority of people. But everybody that are fighting to keep from being incarcerated are Black for the most part. And so then we're talking about people getting paid, y'all. People having jobs and careers based on this. It's more than just, we get the individual officer, like what happened in the George Floyd or, Breonna Taylor. It is a culture and a system we're looking at. And we gotta deal with the fact that in the culture itself. And I dare say we're seeing it clearly now in this presidential election and how the sides are lined up, regardless of how people may say, my 401k is better under this candidate. That's not really it, because the dog whistles have been a big part of it. And the dog whistles do what? They signify race and the racial tension. Isabel Wilkinson's book, Caste, is a real good book to see this. It's one of the latest in the body of literature that have been written to address, you know, the societal problems. The America was built on subjugating a group of people, and it has not left. And how Black people in particular are seen by far too many whites, and I heard George Terrell say this, is it comes out of a culture that had, and a narrative that defines and demeans a certain group of people based on their skin color. And we got to deal with a whole lot of unraveling that and coming to grips with the fact that even though overtly many white folk do not feel that they are racist, there's this implicit things that happen that you just don't realize until somebody points it out. And it's like, I didn't mean it, you know, I didn't mean it. Well, you may not have, but you're part of a culture. And we gotta be real about that. And until we sit down and get real about it, it's like in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What was that about? It was about folk being able to say, okay, yeah, this has happened. This is why it happened. This is why I did it. I came out of this group that saw you all this way. And, you know, the thing that many Blacks didn't like about that was nobody would be prosecuted about it, but it did get stuff out. And until we're willing to address it, you know, until we're willing to address the fact that our nation is built on subjugation, regardless of what the Constitution says, it was not meant to represent Black people. Constitution, Article 1, Section 2. Black people, African people are only 3/5 of humans. Just because you have an amendment, you don't erase the stigma that brings in. And so this thing about relationships is important. So let me close with this. One of the things that I found was helpful, and I'm glad Chief DeHaven was pointing this out, is that as I work with folk in a car, there oftentimes, and many officers can, you know, testify, many times there would be tension between myself and another officer for a number of reasons. And sometimes, a lot of times it was because how we were perceived as treating people. And I had a way of approaching folk one way, and other officers had the idea, we got to make arrests. We want to rise up in the ranks. We want to get all the accolades and all of that. And so there would be tension. By the end of the 8-hour tour, more than likely, that officer and I came to a common ground of understanding because we had time to have conversation. We couldn't go nowhere. We're in the car together, and we're not going to be sitting in this car duking it out. We came to that realization, we can't do that. So we have to have some conversation, and we have to begin to put our guards down and listen to one another. 9 times out of 10, we had a better relationship. Did that change the way they policed? Not all the time, but it changed the way they policed when they were around me. I tell you that. And so that told me that in the police department, on the officer level, we can have a big effect on one another by how much we allow or don't allow. On the macro level, we got to do something about society, or it's not going to make a difference on the ground level. We got to really address what is going on in the society and come to grips with it and be honest about it.
Thank you so much, Reverend. Really appreciate your insight, and it's very honest and true. Your honesty and truthfulness. I think we all need to be transparent, and that's the way we're going to heal. You know, not only individually in our interactions with people, but as a society, and find the soul of America, and maybe get towards what America, this experiment, is really meant to be, with justice for all. I know we have some other questions. We do have a new president too. I just got a notice on my phone. Joe Biden is our new president. So maybe this is a move towards a different future for us all. It might be an omen here today. We have some questions, Tony, in the chat room.
Yes, we do.
Are there any people there that you would like to unmute? Because we have a few minutes, but then we're gonna end this discussion part move into a video about policing in America, the history of it. And then we're going to open up a little bit about bias and trauma. So stay with us. But I would like to take a couple of brief questions and then turn it back to Tony.
Okay, so our first question goes to Lakeisha Frazier. Lakeisha wanted to know from our law enforcement officers what put them on their career paths to be law enforcement officers. And Lakeisha, I'll ask you to unmute.
We actually have a line that we do at our house. We practice this thing.
Uh-oh. There we go. Lakeisha, I'll ask you to unmute, and just in case you have any additional dialogue between the three officers that did present. So those three officers, I'll ask you to unmute. And that's the question. What put you on your career path to becoming law enforcement officers?
Go ahead, whichever officer would like to take that question.
I'll speak about that first. You know, I grew up with my father having been a Washington, D.C. police officer for a few years after he got out of the Vietnam War. You know, he was from Valparaiso originally, as was my mother. After I was born, they wanted to be closer to my grandparents, so they wanted to move back to Northwest Indiana. My father then became one of the original 13 police officers in Maryville, Indiana. When Maryville first became a town, he was a police officer there for 26 years. I honestly had absolutely no intention of going into police work as I was growing up. I went to college. I was intending to be a history teacher and a basketball coach. And I had a basketball scholarship. And one of the people on my team was studying law enforcement. And the more he talked about it, the more interested I became in, you know, being part of a community, serving the community. And, you know, when really searching my feelings and thinking about what my father had done, you know, I wanted to do that as well. So that's kind of how I got into law enforcement. I switched majors, got a degree in law enforcement, got an internship at the Hendricks County Sheriff's Department, which is the county west of Indianapolis, Plainfield area. Ultimately got hired there. And once I got married to my high school sweetheart from Maryville, we wanted to be closer to the community that we had both grown up in. So Valparaiso was hiring, and you know, that's kind of how I ended up here and how I decided to be, you know, in law enforcement.
Thank you. Any other officers like to comment on that, or?
I think I already gave my story. I actually had no desire to be the police.
Tony, do we have any other questions before we move on to the next segment?
Yes, we do. One other question. Robert Cotton wanted to know from the law enforcement panelists or any other law enforcement panelists that are listening in, what is your thoughts, or can you expound on your opinions on the Black Lives Matter movement? And Mr. Cotton, I'm going to ask you to unmute just in case you have any additional dialogue between yourselves and the officers.
Yeah, well, excuse me. Before you do that, I would like for you to actually read the full context of my question because it's actually two questions. Thank you, Tony, and thanks. Hello, Officer Weems.
Hey,
Trooper,
how you doing, sir?
to say, Mike. But you know, I don't know if I can see the question. If you prefer that I read it, but there's my chat box here. First of all, I mean, I don't believe that you can train the type of bias as particularly when we call implicit bias. You can make people aware of it, but it's hard to train that out as a way to deal with a lot of the continuing problems between blacks and police. But I do believe that you know, I'd like to hear about your dispositions or opinions about the value or the merit of third-party independent psychological testing, as well as uniform state licensing on par with what we do at CALIA. I mean, that's not a licensing, but our high standards are such that I think that there is a value, or at least a movement suggesting that maybe licensing from a state and a uniform standpoint might be valuable. I'd like to hear about that, as well as the fact that I've been concerned by the broader view that seems to be reflected on the part of the police, including many of our local sheriff's officers. I've been hearing some pretty disturbing things about their outspoken disposition towards Black Lives Matter, and I don't think that that's healthy, and particularly as it may be reflected in our former police chief's disposition, as well as our county commissioner, who said he didn't give a damn about Black Lives Matter, and then our former police chief seems to think it's a terrorist group, if you will. So I guess
I apologize, but Bob, I don't want to cut you off.
I'm just going
But
to
if you
tail
can
the
get your
question right
question
now.
out so that they can answer it.
Okay. I think I understand the question.
Two
First,
questions.
I'll answer. There were three actually, but
take all three.
In regards to licensing and that sort of thing, the state of Indiana, all police officers are certified by the board. So there's a Indiana Law Enforcement Academy, and in that Indiana Law Enforcement Academy, there's a board of directors, the superintendent of the Indiana State Police being over that board, and all police officers that have been through the academy that are working on a police department here in the state of Indiana are certified and licensed police officers. That licensing can be taken away by the board, by the ILEA, if they fail to meet certain criteria. That's one. Two, with the Indiana State Police and most police departments, I believe there is a psychological evaluation that police officers take. That psychological evaluation obviously cannot be conducted by the police because we are not psychologists nor psychiatrists, and we don't have the authority nor the ability to do that. So that is something that is done prior to being hired. Unfortunately, in order for you to, the same way we can't give you a drug test, the same way we can't do a number of other things, we have to wait until a conditional offer of employment is given before we can give you a psychological evaluation and give you the actual standards test. So that psychological evaluation occurs after a conditional offer of employment has been given. And I can tell you that there have been a number of candidates that we have looked to hire that for one reason or another did not pass the psychological evaluation. Therefore, they were not hired and that conditional offer was rescinded. So a number of things that people have been talking about. And the unfortunate part is that you have, and no offense against any elected official, so please forgive me if this is offensive. One of the reasons why, if you are unaware, the state of Indiana, all police departments in the state of Indiana will be required to wear body cameras, right? And that was done by the governor of the state of Indiana through executive order. That was a command that he made that will happen, right? A body camera is good, but what is a body camera if a traffic stop is instigated or initiated in a vehicle? That's a whole nother story. Just think about that. But I'll go on. In regards to Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, you have to understand that Black Lives Matter, the organization, Black Lives Matter, the cause, and then the Black Lives Matter that has been hijacked, in my opinion, by a number of people who care nothing about Black lives at all. So the movement and the cause and the reason, I am completely for. And to be honest with you, before there was Black Lives Matter, you had a group of people that were watching and making sure that wrongs were right. One of the things that Black Lives Matter was able to do, they were able to bring to light some of the disparities that people already knew, but because of social media and that sort of thing, they were able to get a message across throughout the country and overseas, where that message was able to be broadcast. So Black Lives Matter, the movement, there's nothing wrong with. But the same thing that happened in the 60s with the civil rights movement, and people in just putting their own thoughts out there, the same way that the civil rights movement was derailed because of other folk getting into how are you going to tell me what I should accept? How are you going to tell me what is right? And when I say you, I mean people who don't look like me, but you want to tell me you should be upset about that. Should I be upset about that? I didn't know I should. I'm sorry. But we can't, the Black Lives Matter movement, Mr. Cotton, is good on its face, but we have to recognize that people have ulterior motives. And when you have a Black Lives Matter movement, and I saw one of the comments that talked about the rioting and that sort of thing. Look, most of the Black Lives Matter protests that I had an opportunity to witness, they were peaceful initially. Once those organizers, the initial organizers that actually set them up, left, then you had other people there that did foolish acts, not because they cared about Black Lives Matter, but because they were just in it to do foolishness. And it's hard to say that, but that's the reality of it. CNN ain't talked about a Black Lives Matter rally in about 2-3 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. That's because it ain't important to them right now. It'll be important to them when it gets some news time. Right now, coronavirus and the presidential election is what's more important to them. Black people, they don't care about, just to let you know. Hope that answered your question, Mr. Cotton.
Thank you so much, Chuck. I think we're going to have to move on because we're already beyond our time limit. Tony, can you take over from here? We're going to show another video, and then we're going to move into some implicit bias and trauma.
What is it?
I'm Ariel Sky Williams. I'm 8 years old.
Hi, I'm Rand Abdel Fattah.
And I'm Ram.
We co-host NPR's history podcast, Throughline, to help give some historical context to the police killing of George Floyd and so many other Black people in this country. This week, we're bringing you the deep history of policing in America.
We wanted to understand how the relationship between police and the Black community had evolved to one so bloody and tragic.
So we reached out to this historian.
My name's Khalil Gibran Muhammad. I teach at the Harvard Kennedy School.
In his book, The Condemnation of Blackness, Khalil lays out a historical argument for how Black people have been criminalized over the past 400 years in the US. And he does that by telling parallel narratives about the history of policing in the North and the South. These stories share one key feature: the use of brutal force to control Black Americans.
Policing in America started in the mid-1600s with the Boston Watch, essentially a neighborhood watch crew. But some of the first police forces in the South were created to control enslaved Black people. They would come to be known as slave patrols. Almost all white men had to serve in these patrols.
Their duties were written into law, like this slave patrol statute from Louisiana in 1835.
Arrest any slave or slaves, whether with or without a permit, who may be caught in the woods or forests with any fire or torch, which slave or slaves thus arrested shall be subjected to corporal punishment not exceeding 30 stripes. So the tying together early on, the surveillance, the deputization essentially of all white men to be police officers, and then to dispense corporal punishment on the scene are all baked in from the very beginning.
This eventually brought an end to slavery in America. But for most Black people in the South, it didn't fundamentally change their lives.
And by the early 20th century, the KKK would emerge to enforce control over Black citizens in the South. And this pushed millions of Black citizens to flee to northern, progressive cities as part of what would become known as the Great Migration.
Police officers receive African American migrants in the same way that their white neighbors and community peers did, which is with contempt and hostility. When a white person throws a Molotov cocktail into a new Black homeowner on a street that had previously been all Irish or all Polish or all German, the police come and they arrest the Black family and defend the white mob. And this happens time and time, over and over again. They are policing the racial norms of white supremacy from the very beginning in the North.
Black skin becomes equated with criminality.
And according to Khalil Gibran Muhammad, the system hasn't fundamentally changed since then. He says that pointing out the problem is clearly not sufficient to fix the system.
Because the problem has been known for a century. The evidence has been presented for a century. The recommendations for change, for holding police officers accountable, for charging them with criminal offenses when they behave criminally. It's a century of the same story playing out over and over again. It seems to me that's what's possible is recognizing that police officers and police agencies are incapable of fixing themselves. And so the question that has to be asked in the wake of George Floyd, and I think this question is being asked and answered by more white people than I've seen in my lifetime, is, do white people in America still want the police to protect their interests over the rights and dignity and lives of Black and, in too many cases, brown, indigenous, and Asian populations in this country?
Our whole country is waiting to hear the answer to that question. That was historian Khalil Gibran Muhammad. I'm Ramtin Arablouei.
I'm Rand Abdel Fattah. You can listen to this full episode of NPR's Throughline wherever you get your podcasts and at npr.org/throughline.
Tony, thank you for that. It was a very eye-opening video about the history of policing in America. And from here, we would like to open up a little bit of dialogue between Elaine Spicer, who's a licensed social worker and an expert really on trauma in this situation, and Tony, who's worked in law enforcement as well, who has bring to us a little bit about implicit bias. So Tony, I'm going to turn it over to you and Elaine now for that segment.
Thank you. So implicit bias, what is it? Also known as implicit social cognition. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. I want to thank everyone for being here today. I was monitoring what was going on in the chat, monitoring the discussion as we were going through, and there were a lot of things that I picked up on that I would bring out if I were doing a 4-hour training. But having 10 minutes to kind of talk a little bit about implicit bias, I want to focus first on, the fact that we're sitting around the table, we're on this Zoom table, we're sharing these ideas and sharing thoughts. And one of the evidence-based concepts that we utilize in family therapy and family work is that family meal concept of sitting around the table together as a family and sharing good food, which prompts us to kind of share good conversation and good thought. And I want to thank you all for sharing this good food with me today and this good thought. Shared thought always leads to shared language, and the shared language can open the door for us to have more communication with each other. It allows us to share our interactions and our experiences. It allows us to communicate our values, communicate our beliefs, and talk a little bit about our traditions. And those things are important because it helps us begin the process of breaking down stereotypes and attitudes that really play into our individual biases. Stereotyping, generalizations of groups, creating racial profiles of groups, which inform a backdrop or a frame of reference that informs our conscious and unconscious thinking. And really, when you talk about bias and you talk about the conscious and the unconscious, this is what allows us to put up and create these cognitive barriers and these structural barriers. Cognitive barriers are really based on individual thoughts, ideas, perceptions, but it's the structural barriers and the systemic barriers that allow structural racism to persist in our community. And it really stops the process of social justice from moving forward, because if we can't get on some accord with one another, how are we going to sit around the table and begin to really affect and promote real change if we're not all integrated and thinking the same and having a generalized understanding of what we're bringing to the table as individuals in order to help benefit the system or the group as a whole? But one of the good things about biases is that we all have them. We all experience it. We all go through it. One of the other good things is about biases is that it can be changed. It can be fixed. And I've seen some things in the chat comments about implicit bias trainings, about how we move forward, whether they're overrated, underrated, whether they're useful, whether they're not. What my trainings are typically about when I talk to people about implicit bias is opening the door for conversation, getting people to understand how they were raised, how they grew up, what they've experienced over their lifetime, how they've come to believe or perceive certain situations. And I believe that's important in helping us deconstruct implicit bias. It can be fixed, it can be resolved, it can be one of the things that we move forward with, and it can not be something that stops us from having progress. One of the important things to understand about bias is it's brain oriented, really. And your brain, it's a complex system that filters out the things that we do need and don't need. It puts some things into this automated process, these schemes or schematics, if you will, and it helps us categorize things over the years. And typically when we do things based on our frontal cortex, we begin to slow down. We have a deliberate process in place. We consider facts. We make honest and thoughtful decisions. And we put those decisions into honest and thoughtful action. When you base your situations on your amygdala, your reactions become more biased. You start to ignore things and fill in gaps based on whatever stereotypes you've come to understand throughout your years. You become really more reactionary. Your reactions become fast, and your actions, more times than that, can have a negative outcome. And to put this in perspective, things get manifested when we're afraid, when we're anxious. And one of the things that I always share with people in bringing this home and giving more perspective, this is a car, right? And we all know how to drive. Driving is one of those automated processes in our brain. You don't really think about how to drive. But do you think about, and I want you to do some imagery with me, what constitutes a good doctor? What constitutes a good teacher? What constitutes a good dog? Rest her soul, my grandmother, God rest her soul, went to her grave being afraid of German shepherds. She was afraid of German shepherds because she grew up in the 20s in Texas, My mother to this day is afraid of German Shepherds, and she'll tell you to this day, I'm afraid of those dogs because I've seen what they can do. And that's played in her desire not to have those kind of dogs around her, her children, or her grandchildren. And some of that leads into our fears, which plays into our racial trauma. And I'm going to kick it over to Elaine to start the process of talking a little bit about what racial trauma may mean and what it can do to us.
Thank you, Tony. I guess I need to, I'm unmuted, right? Okay, all right. Wow, that's a lot to take in. And this morning is a lot to take in. And Tony, you were just talking about the brain and how when we can think things through, we know what processes we go through and how we're going to get from A to Z. The problem with trauma is that it triggers everything in the brain, and the brain is not online to think. And what does this have to do with racism? What does this have to do with bias? Well, it has everything to do with it. And I was thinking about a quote that we often say in my field is that what's predictable is preventable. Well, I guess I have to question that now, because we had a lot of discussion this morning about what we can predict and what kind of trainings we put into place, et cetera, et cetera. But those do not seem to then prevent what happens in the end. The burden, and I haven't been asked to say who I think holds the burden, but I don't believe that the burden is on the person who is experiencing the implicit bias or the explicit bias. The burden to do something about it is the folks who are doing that kind of bias, that kind of they're instigating trauma, and they don't realize they're instigating trauma. There's no doubt about it. But there is something that people carry with them. Minorities carry with them this feeling that something is going to happen. Something's going to happen to me. And inside, we just tense up when we think something's going to happen to us. And when we tense up, we can't think. And we do things like, we don't turn our license over to the police. We don't put our hands on the steering wheel. We freeze, or we fight, or we leave. And that's because what's happening in the brain. I think the same thing happens to the person who's approaching. Our examples are Black people, but who are approaching a Black person. And if they're carrying a fear with them that comes from who knows where, they're going to be reacting to that person from the non-thinking part of their brain. I really love the fact that we give psychological evaluations to police officers, and that's fine. I don't think it gets at implicit bias, and I definitely don't think that we should stop doing that. Okay, I do think that we come into a situation with our own prejudices, et cetera, whether we're police officers, whether we're social workers, whether we're teachers, whether we're clerks in a store, or the county clerk at the courthouse. And we have to change the way that we approach people. We have to understand ourselves. We have to understand what fear does to us. And we have to find a way to calm ourselves and to calm ourselves in the moment So a recognition that, okay, I'm not okay, and what am I going to do? Okay, how do I breathe through this situation? It's not an easy thing to do, and people are not taught to do that. We're sort of taught to do just the opposite, and we do react, and we don't. We can't help but reflect on a prior experience. Okay, we're not reflecting on it up here, but we are back here, and it's firing up. And an understanding by those in charge that this is what's happening is really important. George talked initially about what's underneath, and he was talking not about what I'm going to talk about, but I was thinking about behavior and trauma. We see people behave in a certain erratic way, and we make assumptions that something is wrong with that person. We don't consider what's happened to that person. And so underneath those behaviors, whether it's behaviors of children in school, or it's behaviors of the man on the street, the homeless person, who's got his pants down underneath his buttocks and who is schlepping his groceries and everything else and all his worldly goods. We make a judgment about what's wrong with that person. We don't make a judgment. We don't even think about what's happened to that person, what's driving those behaviors. So as people, if we could key into that, key into an understanding that people carry this stuff with them and they react to that. And that's whether we're the person who's eliciting that reaction or we're the person who's reacting, if that makes any sense at all. Yeah. So traumatic experiences that people go through really come to mind when they're faced with it again, or some suggestion that they're faced with it again. It's called triggers. And, you know, you're triggered whether you're the person in charge or you're, I don't want to say the victim, but you're the person who they're targeting or who they're questioning or who they're doing whatever to. And it makes a difference how you respond to that person. And if we can learn as individuals to respond instead of react, and it's difficult because we all carry these implicit ideas about one another, about the city we're driving through or the city we're shopping in or whatever. We all carry that with us. And so we have to be cognizant all the time. I have this thing about trainings. I think trainings are wonderful, okay? But if you have a training and you get all these handouts and you get all this information in your head and you go away from the training and you put the handouts in the drawer and that's it, okay? You've become informed, but it's not how you're seeing things. So we have to unpack those handouts and have to start looking through a certain lens when we're interacting with people. I had a wonderful experience yesterday in a Dollar General. And in that Dollar General, everybody who I interacted with was positive. They were all helpful. And I'm sure that working in a Dollar General is not the greatest job in the world, but they really put aside whatever was going on in their lives to meet the public and to be of service to the public. Well, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all do that in the interactions that we have, because what it does to the person who's receiving that is it makes, oh, this is okay. You know, yeah, we have a pandemic, and yeah, we have, we have a presidential election, but it's okay in here. These people are here, and they're pleasant, and I don't come out of there like this. Okay. Now you might then go to City Hall to do something, and people in City Hall are upset because something may have happened in the city that night. And everybody in City Hall, not everybody, but a number of people in City Hall are feeling that. And they are reacting to people who are coming in and asking questions instead of responding to those people. And that's what trauma does to you. And those experiences are what makes people on edge when they have interactions with most anybody, but particularly people in power. So.
My final thoughts before I turn it over to Greg Jones again. Both concepts, implicit bias, racial trauma, can be somewhat dehumanizing. They're definitely triggered when you're fearful, as Elaine talked about, when you feel like your personal being is being threatened, whether that's on a masculinity level, whether it's on, you feel like your cultural beliefs are being attacked. I think the key to us being able to move forward is not to primarily focus on either of these two concepts, but to merge them together, to integrate them, to talk beyond different social constructs, whether it's law enforcement, healthcare, mental health, school, education. We need to make sure that we're consciously integrating all of these concepts across all of those social constructs and systems that are set in place. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg Jones. He's going to kind of tie things together. We've had a lot going on in the chat, a lot of questions. I'm sure we'll have a lot of new forums that are going to develop out of what we see in the chat. And those of you that have been posting in the chat, I want you to know that your thoughts, your questions aren't just going to go by the wayside. I think the next valuable step is for us to, as an organization, go back through this 2-hour forum and pull out some of the things that people have mentioned and talked about, and look at where we do continuations of what we've started with this dialogue that's been created this morning. So I'm going to turn it over to Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Can everybody hear me? Yep. We've been doing this since about 2010, 2011. Remember Trayvon Martin? That's when we started talking about Northwest Indiana African-American Alliance. There's been a whole lot of people been killed since then. Like hundreds, if not thousands. So this work has been going on for quite a while. I'm very appreciative of all the panelists. I'm very appreciative of all you all's input in terms of this, but this is just a drop in the bucket in terms of what we need to do. I agree with my colleague, Dr. Jackson. It's a systemic issue. So we have to address it as such. But it doesn't mean we have to, step on each other while we're doing it. What we need to do is learn how to work together. And I think this is a great start. So I'm just going to ask Tina to make her final reflections. And I want you all to continue to pursue those questions that you're asked. And Tony, I know that there was a lot of questions that didn't get to today, but we try to get to as best we can those questions that they have. Don't stop asking those questions, and don't stop being concerned about this issue. This is an issue that can be solved if we work together. My experience is that there's more good in people than evil, despite how people act. And so what you got to do is you got to spend some time in that car with one another and have that conversations and look people eye to eye. I really appreciate the courage that you all have shown in terms of raising this issue and dealing with this issue. And if we continue dealing with it, it'll only make our lives better and the communities and our loved ones' lives better as well. So Tina, with that, I'm passing it on to you.
Okay. All right. So again, I apologize for my voice. I have a really nasty cold.
but the Northwest African American Alliance would like to thank all of you for value for your 2 hours of your day for coming out and just spending that time with us. We like to thank Officer Terrance Weems. We like to thank Officer Mike DeHaven. We like to thank Reverend John Jackson. And we like to thank Elaine Spicer. And we like to thank all of our participants, George Terrell and Pat for her wonderful moderation she did today. And of course, Tony for putting this all together.
Don't forget Chad's friend, Jason.
Jason, is he still here?
Jason left, and Lakeisha also.
Okay, we like to thank them as well. If you do not get our mailings, please go to our website at nwiAAA.org. We do have a comment box there where you can send it to our email address. Tell us who you are. If you want our mailings, please check that box and we will certainly put you on our mailing list. Also, we have some forums coming up. Our next one is in, I believe, February for our Black History Month. We do have some dates, so I will give you those. So for Black History Month, we're looking at February 27th, 2010. And then for our spring forum, we will continue our immigration conversations. We're looking at April 22nd. That one will be from 3.
Where are they? Maybe they're in that one. The big freezer? So the other.
Okay, so I hope you heard that. Again, if you do want to be on our mailing list, go to our website, nwiAAA.org. I believe I put that in the chat as well. So again, thank you for your time. I know 2 hours is a lot to devote, but we really thank you for being with us today. And with that note, you guys can all click the little red end button and go on with your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
God bless all of y'all. Take care now. Stay safe. Wash your hands. Keep your mask on.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.
See y'all.
Where do we go on the website if we want to be added to the mailing list again?
Okay, Nor, is that Nor talking?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, that's NWI.
Yeah.
NWIAAA.org.
I'll text it to you, Noor.
Oh, I have the website open. I'm looking for
Okay,
how we
there's a
sign up.
box that says contact us, I believe. Attach. So go to that.
Oh, okay, cool. I found it.
Okay.
Thank you all. God bless.
See you.
Get some lunch.
All right.
Take care, everybody. I'll see you
Bye.
next week. Thank you, Patrice, Patricia. Thanks, Tina. You feeling okay?
I am. I've got a really bad throat right now, so.
That went well. Take care of yourself.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Tony.
You got my cousin is going to join us next week, so I'll send him the link in his email.
All right. Wonderful.
All right, take care of yourself. That went well.
Yeah,
The chat got kind of heated a little bit.
Yeah, it did. You did. All right.
Bye-bye.